STV.
So I'll just invite you to come up in a minute, Lindy. I'll just say something first of all. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the last of the lectures in our program of meetings for this year. Not everybody present is a regular attender. I'm Julian Luxford, and I'm the currently the president of the BAA, and after the reason for mentioning that is that after this lecture, there'll be something called the President's Reception, which it sounds grander than it is, but you're invited to come and have a drink with us outside and a few nibbles, and it's a thing to mark the end of the program and the end of the year. So please hang around for that. We've got a very distinguished speaker with us this evening, Professor Gallet, and in fact, Lindy Grant is going to introduce him, but I just thought that I would, it's probably as appropriate to do it now as it is later. Just to thank you in anticipation for coming along, Professor Gallet, and agreeing to speak to us about this topic. We've wanted to have, of course, we were all horrified about this disaster that occurred back in 2019, and we've wanted to have somebody to come and talk to us about this more or less straight away to find out what's going on, so we're delighted. And thank you very much. But Lindy, if you would.
Thank you, Julian. And Julian asked me to introduce Yves, I suppose just because I've known Yves for really a very long time. Yves and I both worked on Norman Gothic, and that's where I first came across Yves really some years ago, and we found ourselves giving papers at the same conferences as Yves worked on Évreux Cathedral, which is one of the sort of great monuments of Norman Renaissance architecture, I suppose. So it's a huge pleasure to introduce Yves this evening. He studied with Anne Prache and then with Eliane Vergnol, and his real main areas of research are French Renaissance architecture, and I would say that he is the principal French specialist in Renaissance architecture now, and he particularly looks at perhaps slightly later Renaissance and considers the reception of Renaissance architecture, a quintessential Parisian architecture, both in the south of France and into the empire and into Eastern Europe, and that's, I think, very interesting work indeed. Julian referred to the tragedy of the burning of Notre-Dame in 2019, and Yves, who is, as you will see, Professor of History of Art at Bordeaux University, as one of the great experts on in France on medieval architecture, finds himself in charge of the working group of stone and masonry in the Chantier Scientifique de Notre-Dame, and finds himself directing a 35-strong research team investigating Notre-Dame after the fire. So there is nobody better to be able to report to us about the amazing discoveries as his team and other teams worked to repair, restore the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, and I think that work is coming to at least something of a close, ready for the Olympic Games. And also, this year is supposed to be, 2024, is very much a year of entente cordiale between, celebrating the entente cordiale between France and Great Britain. And so it's a particular pleasure to invite Professor Gallet to talk to us about the construction of Notre-Dame, recent research and recent discoveries.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, can you hear me? Okay. It is a great honor and a great pleasure for me to be with you this evening and to talk to you about Notre-Dame Cathedral and the work that has been going on there for the past 5 years. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Lloyd and Lindy, for their kind invitation to come and read this paper. My talk addresses the construction of Notre-Dame with a focus on recent research and recent discoveries. In the weeks following the tragic fire in April 2019, almost 200 specialists from a wide range of scientific areas came together and offered to use their skills and knowledge to help restore the damaged cathedral. These skills were very varied: heritage materials, geology, archaeology, building archaeology, dendrochronology, chemistry, biochemistry, wood biology, paleoanthropology, paleoclimatology, geophysics, mechanics, computing and digital technology, robotics, and even a few art historians specializing in Gothic architecture. This spontaneous mobilization was amplified with the support of the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the CNRS, and the Ministry of Culture, forming what has since been called the Chantier Scientifique Notre-Dame, the Notre-Dame Scientific Workshop. This is an unprecedented research effort which has been hailed as such by the international press, as you can see here. The project ran in parallel with the work carried out by the architects responsible for the restoration, and our aim was to take advantage of the scaffolding that was put in place for the restoration work, to study every aspect of the building, to study how the building is put together with a degree of precision that had never been achieved before. This scientific workshop was divided into 9 working groups, as you can see here on the left. Digital data, a cross-disciplinary working group whose aim is to build a platform for storing, archiving, and visualizing the data collected and produced by the researchers. Then there are 4 material working groups: wood and timber, stone, of which I am the coordinator, metal, that is iron and lead, glass. So these groups to study the materials out of which the cathedral was made, either from what remained in place or from the remains recovered after the fire. The interactions between these materials are being studied by the structure working group, whose members have focused their attention on the structural behavior, on the mechanical behavior of the cathedral, particularly the vaults, because, as you know, a Gothic building is in tension, has to be in tension with the outward thrust of the vaults counteracted by the flying buttresses. Later, a working group was set up to study the cathedral sculpture and mural paintings, and another working group is dedicated to the acoustics of the cathedral, its sound atmosphere, to help restore the pre-fire acoustics and make the great 19th century organ sound like it used to. And finally, a working group of anthropologists whose task was to examine not the cathedral itself, but rather society's reactions to it and to the fire, to better understand our relationship with our cultural heritage. This scientific workshop has already produced significant results in a number of areas. For example, the excavation at the Transcept crossing have led to the exceptional discovery of fragments of the Gothic rood screen, probably dating to the 1230s, which was demolished and buried there in the 18th century. In this talk, I'm going to present some of these results in your own areas of interest. I've selected 6 points to give you an idea of just how much has been revealed about this iconic cathedral, about which we thought we already knew everything. And I'd like to get straight to the heart of the matter by showing you the results of the modeling of the mechanical behavior of the vaults carried out by the structure working group. During the fire in 1219, the cathedral spire fell onto the nave, taking with it part of the sexpotite vaults in the eastern base of the central vessel. The spire hit a transverse arch between bays 3 and 4. It hit the two neighboring vaults, which collapsed, as you can see on this slide. But if the spire had fallen only 2 meters further west and hit the keystone of Bay 3, as you can see here, Oops. So if the spire had fallen 2 meters further west, this would have caused the transverse rib to break. At that point, nothing would have counteracted the thrust of the intermediate pier's flying buttress. It would have collapsed, taking part of the wall with it. And this, in turn, so here, and this, in turn, would have led to the collapse of the rest of the walls and then of the other flying buttresses. And in the end, the disaster would have been a much greater tragedy. 2 meters. What I have just shown you here is not a simple animation. It is not imaginary computer graphics, but the result of a structural calculation which took 3 years of effort. This example will give you an idea of the solid information we now have on the architecture and structure of Notre-Dame. But without even waiting for the results of the modeling, a closer inspection from the scaffolding revealed an often overlooked reality. Notre-Dame de Paris is a building full of irregularities and defects. It is surprising to say this because Notre-Dame, as you can see on this picture, is always presented as the best example of perfection in Gothic architecture, just as if the building, because it was Notre-Dame de Paris, was, of course, of the highest possible quality. The nave, in particular, is very irregular. Contrary to what art photographs and old plans would have you believe, here a plan by Viollet-le-Duc, the north and south walls of the nave are not correctly aligned. If you stand with your back to the wall on the south side, looking northwards, and then the other way around, looking north to south, you will see, thanks to the rigorously straight grid formed by the scaffolding, that the south wall of the nave is not exactly opposite the north wall. You can see that the northwest pier of the crossing, here, is further west, while the southwest pier of the crossing is offset. This is here, the same beam that you see here. So north, the pier lies here, and south, it lies here. This is probably because the north and south sides of the nave were not built together, but one after the other. So instead of what ancient old plans show, this is the actual reality. Eventually, the offset made it difficult to center the rib vault correctly. To correct these irregularities, it was first necessary to adapt the shape of the keystone, which is highly asymmetrical. And, as this was still not enough, it was necessary to adapt the shape of the last voussoir when connecting the ribs to the keystone. It must be added that the vaults were put in place long after the walls were built. We noticed this by looking above the capitals. There, lines were incised to guide the masons in laying the first voussoirs of the arches. However, as you can see, the ribs in place do not follow the lines marked out for laying. Moreover, the transverse arches, thicker than those initially planned, sometimes had to be merged with the diagonal ribs, as you can see in this picture on the left. And wall ribs and their bases already built even had to be amputated to find enough space to accommodate the ribs and transverse arches. Same slide on the middle and on the right. Detailed observations also lead us to wonder whether the slender Andély shafts that characterize the nave of Notre-Dame, magnificent though they are not the result of a change of plan during construction. Indeed, above the arcade capitals, the supports for these shafts appear to have been built against the wall, after the fact, so to say, as if they had not initially been planned. You can see this very clearly on these two pictures. To the west, the scaffolding grid, which is, for safety reasons, perfectly orthogonal, also shows that the masonry of the nave is leaning towards the facade. This slope reflects a misalignment in horizontal levels between the eastern base of the nave on your right, which were built first, and the facade on your left, which was built later, and the western base of the nave, which make the connection, are therefore sloping. Finally, the windows, remodeled in the 13th century, are themselves full of irregularities, as you can see here, although the tracery generally adopts the same design, consisting of two pointed lancets topped by a large oculus, the proportions change from one bay to the next. The height of the lancets is not identical, nor is the diameter of the oculus, nor the size of the window itself. These numerous irregularities are invaluable, as they allow us to distinguish between the different construction phases of the nave and then to reassess its chronology. But more fundamentally, they also show that Notre-Dame is full of irregularities, which become apparent as soon as you examine the building closely. And this is a rather new finding, because until now, Notre-Dame was considered to be one of the most regular and perfect of the great Gothic cathedrals. To show you the precision with which we have had the chance to examine Notre-Dame, I would like to take you to the south arm of the transept, the second point. Here too, let's climb into the upper levels of the cathedral. From below, we spotted the intriguing keystone of the sexpotite vault. Intriguing because with its monster head with upturned lips and its exaggerated expressions, it seemed to us to be more a creation of Viollet-le-Duc than a medieval keystone. So we took a closer look at it, a very close look, and from an angle that had never been tried before, by slipping between the monster's head and the intrados of the vault. And we were surprised to discover a previously unrecorded date sculpted above the head. As you can read, 1728, so 1728. And not every day is one fortunate enough to add a new date, the architectural history of a building like Notre-Dame de Paris. This first shows that the keystone is neither a 19th century forgery, neither a genuine medieval creation. And to be fully understood, this date needs to be compared with the dates of the reconstruction of the vault at the Transcept crossing by the king's architect Germain Beaufranc, who also rebuilt the rows of the south arm in 1726. But no one ever suspected that Beaufranc might have rebuilt the sexpotite vault of the south arm too. So the date we discovered confirms that the work carried out in the 11th century was more important than previously thought. The scaffolding, point 3, the scaffolding also made it possible to examine another keystone, the keystone in the apse. This time, a much more important keystone because this is the symbolic and liturgical center of the cathedral, directly above the high altar. Here again, the treasure was out of reach and almost out of sight until the fire and the scaffoldings put in place in 2019. Closer access revealed an important fact. The lower part, the inferior part, is indeed made up of a disc decorated with a cross-shaped motif. But on the west side, this ornament is completed by a sphere stamped with a cross, as you can see more clearly on that picture. Vestiges of polychromy, gold and red, are visible. I guess red is Armenian ball. This finding is surprising because on the same spot, Viollet-le-Duc, who is considered to be a great connoisseur of Notre-Dame, drew a human head. So he made a mistake, and a significant one, because the symbolism of the sphere adorned with a cross is very different, of course, and much more meaningful than a human head. The difference has already been pointed out, for example, by our colleague from Paris, Danny Sandron, and before him by Robert Brunner, but the difference has rarely been commented on. And when Robert Brunner looked at the keystone from the ground, he saw only a simple ball, whereas it is in fact a sphere with a cross on it. So what does this mean? The closest comparisons to this motif are found on reliquaries of the true cross. For example, that of Roncesvalles in northern Spain, which suggests a possible relationship with the relic of the true cross held by the clergy of Paris Cathedral since 1120. And this relic was, in fact, the only relic of any importance held by the cathedral at the time the choir was built. Actually, the other relics were brought to Notre-Dame later or much later. For example, the discovery of a set of prestigious relics under the ground of a church called Saint-Étienne and mentioned in Robert de Torigny's chronicle didn't occur until 1186. And it is not certain that that church was in fact the Saint-Étienne Basilica that preceded the present Gothic cathedral. As for the relic of the crown of thorns, today the jewel in the crown of Notre-Dame, it didn't arrive in Paris until 1239, and it was, in any case, destined for the Sainte-Chapelle. It wasn't until the French Revolution that it was transferred to Notre-Dame. One thing leading to another leads us to wonder whether other elements of Notre-Dame might have been linked to the theme of the cross. And of course, the oculi that took the place of the triforium in Notre-Dame come to mind. Viollet-le-Duc restored them, as you know, around the Transcept crossing, but he fitted them with a fanciful tracery. And a detailed study by Chantal Hardy, published in 1991, showed that these oculi in the choir were originally stamped with a cross. Under such circumstances, we must consider the hypothesis of an architecture related to the relic of the true cross, some sort of a speaking architecture, rather than a system designed to lighten the wall, as Viollet-le-Duc thought. The keystone of the apse, with its cross-stamped sphere, would then have fitted the architectural and decorative system like a glove. The idea is particularly appealing when considering the context of the 1170s, 1180s. In 1177, in the Holy Land, at Montgisard, the Crusaders won a resounding victory over the Muslims, a victory that Robert de Torigny attributed to the virtù of the true cross carried in front of the Crusader army. As you can read here, Per virtutem sanctae crucis vicerunt. Then in 1187, 10 years later, there was a military setback. This time it was Saladin, who defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and took the true cross. Therefore, the period between 1177 and 1187 was suitable, very suitable, for an exaltation of the true cross. And according to the text, this is exactly the period when construction of the choir of Notre-Dame was under completion. All this leads to a fairly new reading of the architecture of Notre-Dame, which also has the advantage to art historians of explaining why Notre-Dame, unlike the great cathedrals of its generation, such as Laon, Noyon, Soissons, has no triforium. However, this new reading presupposes that we have solved a problem that has not previously been raised, a problem linked to the re-examination of the roof structure, and which I am now going to tell you about. In the 1990s, a series of dendrochronological dating tests were carried out on the roof timbers of Notre-Dame. The conclusions were as follows. Before 1226 for the roof of the apse, around 1230, 1240 for that of the nave, and a set of timbers reused in the nave dated to around 1160, 1170. The fire in 1219 provided an opportunity to re-examine the framework as a whole, as many of the beams had not been completely burnt. And even partially or totally charred, they could be studied and they could provide our colleague, paleoanthropologists of the wood working group with interesting records. Based on the analysis of 2,000 samples, the new dates, you can see here, are quite different from the earlier ones. Around 1185 for the first frame, around 1214 for the nave, around 1230 for the choir, with a final modification around 1290. So you can compare with what we once thought was the truth. At first sight, the new date of around 1185 for the first roof frame of the choir fits quite well into the chronology drawn from textual evidence. In 1177, Robert de Torigny described the choir as almost complete, with the exception of the large roof. And then in 1182, the high altar was consecrated. However, an unexpected problem appears. The vaults of the choir, here in yellow, are strongly curved and rise higher than the top of the upper walls in their initial height, marked by a billet cornice. This is the red line. The vaults allow two tie beams to pass through, these two tie beams here and here, which led specialists to say that the framework associated with this phase of construction should have only two main tie beam trusses, but that the other trusses should have no real tie beam, but instead what we call in French a faux entrée, that is a horizontal tie beam which does not connect the rafters at the foot of the truss, but which is slightly raised, as shown here on the screen. Unfortunately for this hypothesis, the examination of the post-fire timbers shows that the first frame systematically included trusses with tie beams, with real tie beams, and 7 tie beams have been identified. So how could this framework be made compatible with the vaults, which allow the place for only 2 tie beams? The only possibility is that the wall was raised at its present level, the blue line, but this raising is not considered to have been carried out until around 1200. In this case, the vaulting would not date from the 1180s, but around 1200. And the iconography of the true cross would not suit the historical context at that date. The problem is therefore the date at which the walls were raised. Stilistically, the question is difficult to answer because both date, 1180 or around 20 years later, both dates are coherent. Archaeologically, a date of around 1180, 1190 is possible since one of the iron clamps that held the wall blocks together at the very top of the walls has been, also here, has been radiocarbon dated to before 1180 at 89%. But this argument is not that reliable, as the date when clamps were forged is not necessarily the date when they were used. So, a case to follow. Alongside the question of the end of the works, there was also the question of the very beginning of the construction site. In the state of knowledge before the fire in 2019, the date was established only by textual evidence, which attributed it to Bishop Maurice de Sully, 1160-1196. We wanted to find out more, so we tried to find more reliable dating information. Our research in the oldest parts of the building, the ambulatory, led us to look at the wooden beams that stabilized the piers at the top during constructions. Some of these beams must still have existed in the 15th century, as they appear in an illuminated manuscript by Jean Fouquet, The House of Étienne Chevalier, with a scene taking place in the north aisle of the nave of Notre-Dame. Dating these beams would help determine how far the work had progressed before the vaults of the ambulatory were built. Our work, therefore, consisted in locating any stone or mortar plugs that might have existed above the capitals, here, plugs that closed the holes in which the wooden tie rods had been embedded. Once the plugs had been identified, they had to be removed and the ends of trapped timbers extracted and, if possible, dated. Extraction wasn't always easy, but we were fortunate to find several pieces of beams intact. Among the beams, 5 pieces could be dated by Dendrochronology, and 2 of them very precisely, as they had preserved all their growth rings. One was felled in the winter of 1171-72, and the other in the winter of 1172-73. What conclusion shall be drawn from this archaeological dating? First, it represents a major breakthrough for the chronology of Notre-Dame, and therefore for the history of the early Gothic period, a period for which we often lack reliable dating information. And we now have the first date based on material analysis for the chronology of the choir of Notre-Dame. This archaeological date, 1173, is coherent with textual evidence. It also provides new information about how the construction went on. And the first result in this regard is that the vaults of the ambulatory cannot be earlier than 1173. This is a valuable point of reference to establish the chronology of the choir. As to the upper levels, given that the galleries, the oculi, and the upper windows cannot be earlier than 1173, and since they were already built around 1177, when Robert de Torigny saw the choir almost complete, that is to say, in less than 5 years, building activity must have progressed at an extremely rapid pace. As to the beginning of the work, we have to admit that the date of 1173 reopens the debate as to when the building work began. Between 1160-63 on one part, the beginning of Maurice de Sully's episcopate, and when the first stone was laid, and on the other part, 1173, 10 years, was there enough time to dig the foundations several meters deep, to build the masonry for the foundations, to build the outer walls of the ambulatory, and then to edificate the double row of the piers of the choir? Or should the work start before 1160? That is to say, before Maurice de Sully. It is easy to understand the enormous change in the history of Notre-Dame such a conclusion would lead us to. The last point I'd like to talk about this evening is the thickness of vaults in Notre-Dame and in Gothic architecture. Thickness, or more precisely, the thinness of vaults. Because what the collapses revealed after the fire was, above all, the extreme thinness of the vaults of Notre-Dame. It is very difficult to estimate the thickness of a vault because you are either above or below it. It is rarely possible to measure the thickness directly, except in the case of cracks or collapses, which is what happened at Notre-Dame. In the choir, as you can see here, the vaults revealed to be between 12 and 15 centimeters thick. In the nave, a little more. This is hardly believable given the impressive height of these vaults, 32 meters, and their wide span, 13 meters. But what exactly do these measures mean? In other words, what is the standard thickness of a Gothic vault? And for that matter, was there even a standard thickness for vaults in the Gothic period? The question is directly linked to a major phenomenon that took place in French Gothic architecture in the 12th and 13th centuries, the quest for height, which culminated at 48 meters high with the vaults of Beauvais Cathedral, but which began with Notre-Dame de Paris, whereas the previous cathedrals were no more than 24 meters high. Does such an achievement in Paris have anything to do with the thinness of the vaults? To answer this question, we had to gather data, which unfortunately is nowhere to be found. No book on Gothic architecture seems to address this issue. We therefore undertook to measure the thickness of the vaults using several methods that we combined. Direct measurements were possible during a restoration, for instance. Measurements by ground-penetrating radar, GPR, as you can see here on the left, occurred from the extradus of the vaults in Chartres, here in the top middle of the screen, or in Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, near Notre-Dame, here in the lower middle. And finally, measurements using a digital model. We now have a corpus of around 10 cases, 8 to 10 cases, which we are expanding as part of a research project funded by the French National Research Agency, which has started last year, the Altior, Altus, higher, the Altior project, of which I am the PI. The results, the preliminary results, are summarized in this table, which highlights a number of conclusions. First, the thickness of the vaults does not change linearly over time. Second, the vaults of Notre-Dame de Paris in the choir here are the thinnest measured to date. And third conclusion, there seems to be no direct link between the height of the vaults and their thinness. Chartres Cathedral, for instance, is higher than Paris, 36 meters, but is much thicker, and the vaults are around 45 centimeters, 4 times the thickness we measured in Notre-Dame. So it was not the greater thinness of the vaults in itself that enabled the architect of Notre-Dame to raise the vault up to 32 meters. Thickness appears to have been one parameter among many others, such as the geological origin of the stones, their mechanical strength and resistance, the way they were put in place, the structure of the flying buttresses, and so on. Nevertheless, this inquiry into the thickness of Gothic vaults provides us with very new information, raises new questions, and sparks pioneering research that had never been undertaken before. To conclude, I'd just like to say a few words. Although the research I have presented mainly concerns the stone working group that I had the honor of coordinating for 5 years, I hope that you gain a better idea of how the scientific workshop has operated since the fire in 1219. I hope that you gain a better idea too of the very significant renewal of knowledge about a monument that we thought we knew, but which had never been studied with such accuracy from the point of view of its materials. The results are in, and they are important for resilience in the face of the fire that damaged the building. It is still too early to draw all the lessons from the enormous amount of data that has been collected over the last 5 years by the 9 working groups, but it is to be hoped that in a few years' time, we, or perhaps our successors, will be able to write a more comprehensive history of this magnificent, though irregular, cathedral. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an absolutely wonderful presentation of what looks to us over here like a model of how to deal with such a terrible tragedy from a research point of view, and has presented, as you say, some real challenges to how we think about Notre-Dame and what we know about Notre-Dame, and I'm sure there are lots of questions. I open it to the floor.
Vous pouvez rester ici pour traduire ou pour
oui,
m'aider à
okay,
répondre.
yes. Do I have some questions? Yes, Jackie.
Thank you. To continue our discussion on foundations, Lindy, what I would like to know is you showed us these irregularities at different heights, and I wondered if they reflected irregularities in the laying out, or if the laying out was very perfect and the movement happened as it was built.
The irregularities are in the nave. The choir is perfectly built, but the work progressed over many decades, and at each step there were modifications. The nave is very particular because it was built, the choir was built in an area where there was no church before. But the nave took the place, I don't know if I can say that,
Yes.
of the former cathedral. So it could not be built bay after bay to the facade. It was most irregular, and builders had to deal with the structures, the constructions that were still
Still there.
help.
Is
Yes,
that
still
why
there.
You think they built one side and then the other?
Yes, that's the reason why the north side was built before, and the south side, that's probably the reason, and the south side in a second step.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, Alexandra.
Thank you so much, Yves. That was just so enlightening. About this argument about the oculi and the crosses and the connection to the relic of the true cross. Notre-Dame did own a relic of the true cross, is that correct?
Yes?
Yes. And did you in the end, sorry if you said that and I didn't quite understand, did you find it convincing? Do you think the oculi refer to the relic of the true cross. Is that what's intended?
Yes.
And the relic was on the high altar underneath?
Yes.
Probably. Probably. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, just to echo that, it's a magnificent talk, extremely interesting, just full of details as you obviously intended. I'm sorry, this is not a question about your research, but what is the evidence for these oculi having a cross in them? You know these because...
Well, this is the article by Chantal Hardy, published in the Bulletin Monumental 30 years ago,
Yeah.
or something like that. And elle a examiné toute la documentation.
She looked very carefully
Yeah.
at
No. She looked very carefully at what Viollet-le-Duc said.
Antiquarian.
And she found out that he had invented, voilà, the forms, the tracery of the tracery he restored, and that the former, the initial tracery, the initial design was that of a cross, and the way the elements, the stone elements, were curved is very reminiscent of monumental crosses in the Ile-de-France and the north of Ile-de-France at that time.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I can see Michael, but just behind Michael. Yes, yes, yes. Just okay.
I have a question from our online audience. Apart from wonderful, thank you, very exciting from Wolfenbüttel, does the vault thickness correspond perhaps with local conditions like wind speed or earthquake frequency across your range of samples?
Earthquake, I'm not sure. The thickness of vault, or the thinness in Notre-Dame, is, to my point of view, only a part of the environment of what the architect had in mind, because the walls are extremely thin as well, 60 centimeters at the top. In Chartres Cathedral, for instance, when we surveyed the vaults, I measured the depth, not the width of the walls. It is 1 meter, and our colleagues from the metal working group have found hundreds of iron clamps in Notre-Dame, which led them to conclude that Notre-Dame was the first Iron Lady of Gothic architecture. To my mind, I'm not sure of that, but I think that the fact that the architect used so many iron clamps and also timber, comment on dit des tirants?
Tie beams.
Pas dans une charpente, dans un...
Beams. You mean
between the piers.
Tie beams.
Tie beams, okay.
Yes.
So he used many, he tried as much as he could to reinforce the masonry, but the masonry is really thin everywhere. So the vault is coherent with that, with such a thinness.
All these physical things are really fascinating. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask about something else, because in your original introduction, you mentioned the anthropological work, and I wondered if you could give us a glimpse into some of that as well.
Sorry, could you speak
The anthropology.
slowly?
The anthropology, in addition to the physical finds, what did your anthropological team discover? Can you give us any insights there?
About archaeology,
Anthropology.
anthropology.
Yes, the team, what are they working on?
Yes, they tried to examine how French society, in its varied, dans ses différentes couches, dans ses différentes strates.
Different levels, yes. Classes, just want to say that. No, it's different strata, yes.
Reacted. So
Yes.
many of them in a very passionate way, but some of them very with some sort of a reluctance. I don't know is the the word. Reluctance to. They were not at all enthusiastic about the restoration work. It was when the fire occurred in 1219. It was a very the public opinion was very divisé, structuré.
Yes, conflicted, divided. Yes.
Divided, and there was, I guess you've heard about that, les gilets jaunes, who saw that millions and millions of euros were given very easily for the restoration work, but there was nothing for the people. So the anthropologists have studied how different parts of the society have reacted to this. And they have also examined other heritage situation, disasters in Japan, in Brazil, Brazil, and so on.
Perhaps
Sorry.
they'll be involved, or similar approaches will be taken now because they've just had a terrible fire in Denmark, haven't they? In the wars in Denmark.
Yes, most lately.
Yes, yes. David.
That's okay. I'll add my thanks for a fascinating talk. Thank you very much. And I'm afraid it's going to be yet another question about relics. It isn't the only thing, I assure you, that people in Britain are interested in. But the English, during the First Crusade, the Third Crusade rather, Richard I is documented as collecting quite a significant number of Passion relics, even though they didn't quite make it, including bits of the Holy Sepulchre. And also, he did acquire portions of the cross whilst in the Holy Land. And I wondered if during the Third Crusade, any relics were collected by French crusaders of the true cross and might have found their way to Notre-Dame.
I'm not sure I understand.
He talked about Richard I, Richard Coeur de Lion, on the Third Crusade with Philip Augustus, and Richard collected a lot of relics, including parts of the True Cross, so a lot of Passion relics, and brought them back. And Michael was asking whether some Passion relics were brought back on the Third Crusade to Notre-Dame, but you think not.
No. So far, what we know is that in Notre-Dame Cathedral, there was only local relics. There was the relics of Saint Marcel, one of the first bishops of Paris, and that's all very not very important relics. Then in 1120, a former member of the chapter went to Jerusalem and sent a piece of the True Cross to Paris. But this was the first major relic that the chapter of Notre-Dame possessed. And the other relics mentioned by Robert of Torigny were discovered during the excavation in the ground of a church called Saint-Étienne, but it was in 1186, not in 1160s or 70s. It was later. And we are not sure whether these relics, this church, Saint-Étienne, was the Basilica Saint-Étienne, which was there before the Gothic cathedral, or if it was another church in Paris called Saint-Étienne. So the relic of the true cross was really, we have forgotten this, because it is a mid-12th century reality. And we are accustomed to think that in Notre-Dame, the major relic is that of the crown of thorns. But it is a 13th century situation, not a 12th century situation.
Yes, Alexandra.
Sorry, Yves, one more question, if you don't mind. You temptingly showed us the changes to the elevation in that they had added the underlay shafts and the changes to the vaulting. So what in the end do you deduce from that? What would the original elevation have been like?
This is a question we have not solved yet. I'm trying to get back to the picture. It is this one. So what do you think?
I haven't worked there for 5 years on the scaffold.
Well, we've walked along the scaffoldings many times. We have looked at that. It is not to be seen from the ground. It is hidden by the capitals. And we wondered what it might mean, I don't know. But it seems that the blocks were put against the wall after the wall was built. Well, I can't say anything more. Just one thing I can add. At their top, these shafts are tied to the wall by iron clamps. I don't know, clamps? Clamps?
Yes.
Clamps. Yes. So the clamps are are put in place with the wall. So this means that maybe it's an afterthought, but an afterthought that which occurred very within a very short time after the wall was built.
Fascinating, thank you.
Can I ask, I think it's very fascinating that you talk about the perfection, if you like, of the laying out of the choir, and then the imperfections of the nave, but that does make sense in terms of that they're dealing with previous work on the site, and really fascinating. Can I ask two questions? When do you think it's begun? Do you think 1160? I mean, it's because, and I can't remember exactly what the text is, which says that Maurice de Sully starts the cathedral and he becomes bishop in 63, but he's dean beforehand, isn't he? And people have suggested that he's responsible for the building when he's dean, and you know, then it carries on. So people have tried to push it back well into the late 50s, I suppose. So I'd like to know your views about that. And the other thing is, I thought those images of the choir screen were fascinating, and I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more about that.
My opinion is not a scientific argument. So I won't tell you what I think. The problem with textual evidence about Maurice de Sully is that the text that gives the date of 1163 and the laying of the first stone, foundation stone, was written in the 14th century. So very late. It's not the author was not an eyewitness, as was I think here Gervase of Canterbury. This is much later, and the author was a canon of the Abbey of Saint-Victor, where precisely the Bishop Maurice de Sully was buried. So the idea that Maurice de Sully had initiated the construction work the Abbey of Saint-Victor would benefit from this idea. So this is a document that we can't really that we must look at with very carefully. Some chroniclers of the 12th century say that Maurice de Sully worked mainly on the cathedral. They don't say that he was the first. Voilà. So it depends on the way you can imagine the construction site in 10 years in that area of the Ile de la Cité with the ground and the river. So how many years, how many months do you think it was necessary for digging the foundations to 6 to 7 meters deep to fill this foundation, these holes with masonry, then to build the outer wall, then to build the pier of the double ambulatory, then the pier of the choir? Is it possible in 10 years? If you think so, then Maurice de Sully is a good hypothesis. If you think it's there's a problem. So I can't answer you. I can't answer the question yes or no. I can just say the facts, and what we think about how we interpret these facts.
Fascinating. And the choir school, yes.
I'm not authorized to talk about this because, as you can see on the pictures, going back here, okay. Pourquoi ça revient pas? Voilà. As you can see here, the photographs are by the Institut National de la Recherche Archéologique Préventive, and they have the exclusive right. Can we say like that?
Yes.
To study this and to talk about this and to show pictures. We are not authorized in the scientific workshop to talk about it. What I can,
Could you informally
yes,
talk here and we won't
yes,
tell them?
the story began in 1222. We were in the scaffoldings in the upper parts.
2022.
What did I say?
You said 1222.
Oh, no. 2022. We were in the scaffoldings in the upper parts of the nave, and the archaeologists were